is for Hungary, one of them is sort of the European Union. You can deposit your remarks in any way that you want. You can sort of write it on a piece of paper and put it in a box there, or you can send an email to Zoltan, but we would love to have your feedback. And as I said, it's not something that everybody sort of needs to sign on and everybody's signatures then on that. It's a statement that's going to be issued by the organizers of the conference. Thank you. So I think we move now over to Mr. Marco Oneda.
Yeah, and hopefully everything will work fine. Marco is joining us online.
You have to let me share the screen.
Oops. Yeah. And I hope you hear Marco.
I don't have the sharing rights at the moment.
Just a sec. I try to recover it again. You should have the sharing option.
It's blurred. Well, let's try like this. Yes, now it's arrived. Yes. Is it working?
Not good. No, it comes because the dark
It's
scene
very, very slow.
very slow.
It's,
But
yes, before when we tried, it went faster. Do you see the presentation now?
not yet, but again, I hope it comes soon. We still see a dark screen, Marco.
Interesting. I should it worked 1 minute ago. Let's try this way.
Yeah, we see your presentation, not in a presentation mode, but in a
Okay.
mode.
Presentation mode now. You see now what is
Just a
this
sec.
mode?
Again, probably internet is kind of slow, the computer is slow, but
Yes.
still in an editing mode.
As you say.
And I have to tell the audience that we tested it and it worked a
Yes.
few minutes ago.
So
Still
now
in
you
still
see
in
also
editing mode.
presentation
Still in
mode.
an editing mode.
That's like it did before. That we shared the entire screen, but it doesn't let me do it. Entire screen. If I do entire screen, it doesn't give me the right. I only have the right to share. Let's try like this. I close and reopen. It's very disturbing because if I go on entire screen, the sharing button doesn't work. If I go on window, the sharing button.
Probably down on the pan.
To replace wood with plastic, I think.
Oh,
Hello.
at least you are on the screen.
Can you share his slide? Can you show his slides, Sultan?
No.
Does it matter if it's on editing? We can still
Yeah,
see them.
Marco, if you can share only the editing version and then maybe click on each of the
I
slides.
think it's okay now. Check now.
Okay.
Check 1, 2.
Yeah. Okay. Just a
And,
second.
and
Don't move.
moving, check if it's moving.
Don't move.
It moves. Great.
Okay. Good. So shall I start?
Yeah. Start. Okay. Thanks.
Well done.
5 years that we do online conferences. Anyway, thanks for this invitation. Thank you, Zoltan. Thank you, everybody. I apologize for not being able to be there in presence. So I'm very grateful that you gave me this opportunity to connect from Brussels. So I give you a little bit of an introduction to the EU policy scene. First, just to recap that we're not talking when we talk about the EU forest policy, it's not something new, but it's something which has been ongoing for several years or even decades. The first EU forest policy dates from December 79. The first EU forest strategy from 98. There was a quite well-known green paper in 2010 when we started talking about forest in relation to climate change. Then 2013, the new EU forest strategy, and 2011 again the new EU forest strategy, which is the one like the one we have now until 2030, and then in November 2023 legislative proposals which are being discussed at the moment at EU level on forest monitoring and forest governance. So this just to say that EU forest policy is not something that comes now. It's actually a well consolidated policy, although of course that doesn't mean that the results are there in all respects. On the contrary, there's still a long way to go to face the challenges that we have. Now, a couple of general considerations. First of all, it's very important to remember that the EU forest policy is a shared competence with the EU member states, despite what it is often heard in certain circles that the forest would be a national competence because forestry is not mentioned in the treaty. That's absolutely not the case. It's a shared competence because, as the Court of Justice said, forest protection is part of environmental protection, which is a shared competence of the EU. And of course, there are also other EU competences which affect forest, not least agricultural, climate, which is part of the environment, or disaster prevention. So in all these fields, the EU has exercised its right of taking initiatives and has also legislated. So it's absolutely no question to say that forest is a national matter. But unfortunately, you still hear it sometimes. There was also very recently a written question by Parliament stating forest policy is a national competence. The EU is almost acting is competent. Of course, this was replied the right way with reference to the court judgment and so on. But it comes back very often, this issue. Now, second general consideration, the relevance of forests has increased enormously under the European Green Deal. And that's because forests are at the heart of both crisis, climate and biodiversity. Of course, more as solutions that the forests are not the reasons of the crisis, they are the potential solutions and also victims of the crisis in both cases, both climate and biodiversity loss. And today, it's interesting to see that basically all EU institutions and organs are involved in forests, so not only the co-legislator, which are discussing the legislative initiatives, but I'm just mentioning here as an example a report of the European Court of Auditors of 2021 on EU funding for biodiversity, climate change in EU forests. That's just as an example when the European Court of Auditors steps in. It's that usually the policy is well consolidated, and another institution is the European Investment Bank that is very active at the moment in financing interventions on forests. So this is just to say that the forests they now permeate a bit the whole range of institutions in the EU. So that's actually the policy context we have today. This is actually a slide that we use when we present the new forest monitoring framework that you see in the center, but it's very useful to see the different type of instruments that we have that are relevant for forest, including the ones of environmental nature, in blue the one that's related more to climate change, in pink the ones which relate more to bioeconomy, and in yellow those which relate to data gathering, monitoring and accounting. And you can see that there are several pieces of legislation or policy. Of course, these are not only binding legislation, but there are several strategies that have either forest as the center of their focus, like for instance the EU forest strategy, obviously, or they affect forests heavily, like the deforestation regulation, the nature restoration law, the LULUCF, obviously, the carbon removal certification for the part of carbon farming, and so on and so forth. So this is a pretty large the scope of instruments which affect forests is pretty large today, which is, I think, it's a useful starting point for the future to see what we need, what is working, what is not working, where we have to create synergies, where we have to close gaps. So that is a useful, let's say, mapping exercise. Just before we go on, to recap some basic facts. I mean, you know these things. Forest is it's almost half of the European covered with, of course, a lot of differences. 3 countries which have more than 60% forested area, and some countries which are about 1/3, and some which are around 10%. But what is also important to know that in European forests, and actually it was said in the beginning, the attention to forests was for decades in Europe was diverted, was only, let's say, focusing on tropical forests, and European forests have not been in the spotlight. But it's a fact that more than 85% of our forests are used for wood supply, and that has a price that we pay. At the price that we pay, for instance, we practically no longer have primary and outdoor forests that are about maximum 3% estimated in Europe. That's a mapping exercise which is ongoing in the member states, and primary forests, 9% of those are concentrated in 4 countries. Many countries we absolutely don't find any primary forests and hardly find any own-growth forests. So that's a fact. So we've gone pretty far in exploiting our resources in Europe. There is a complication which relates, of course, to the ownership regime, because we have an average of 60% private, 40% public. The public forests have, of course, a completely different mission than the private forests, although you don't always hear that made clear. But of course, depending on the situations, there are associations of public forests that they say, well, we do have a social mission which goes beyond just profit making of selling wood, and that's actually quite important for the future. Then, of course, there is an issue of increase of natural disturbances, which is impacting heavily on European forests. So that is actually something which is very interesting, because if till a few years ago, one could have said that biodiversity in forests would be a luxury to reconcile biodiversity with the current level of exploitation of intensive forestry, particularly in the poorer region. Today, that's absolutely not possible, because even if one would say, okay, I don't care about biodiversity, actually biodiversity is the only possibility to have resilient forests. So if you don't have a biodiverse forest, you don't have a resilient forest, and then basically you lose out your resources also for timber production. So that is, if you want a development which is happening independently of what the legislator does, the climate change is taking a heavy toll on forests, and doing it much faster than the legislator is intervening at national and European level. So that is something that happens anyway. So that, of course, informs the current discussion on what to do for the future, and in particular on biomass availability in light of the agenda, which, as you know, is one of the priorities for the future. So I think these basic facts are important to remember, and let's not forget that that's average composition of forests in Europe. We have a very large share. Majority of European forests are either monoculture or very limited in number of species, which is the opposite of resilience, of course, because the less the forest is biodiverse, the less the forest is resilient. And you can see that half of the European forests have maximum 2 to 3 species, and also 3/4 of European forests are even aged, which means, of course, when the structure is homogeneous, which is done for the purpose of standardizing nature in order to reduce costs for harvesting and for working timber in the sawmills and so on, which is typically what we do in agriculture. Apply that model to forest, of course, you obtain forests which are less resilient. So the forest structure today is very much related to that. And then, of course, you know that the carbon sink of forests is going down. These are facts that are shown by science. That in the last decade, the sink related to trees to forests is going down, and that is, of course, a clear problem in terms of complying with the climate targets that the climate will try to do in 2050 and so on and so forth. So yeah, and then of course not to speak about biodiversity here, I would like also to clarify something, because there is a lot often criticism that the figures from the Annex 1, this is the biodiversity status on Annex 1 forests, or the forests which are covered by the Habitats Directive, and the results that are in the State of Nature report, which shows that half of the assessment show poor conservation status. So this is actually the result of the not very satisfactory, actually poor biodiversity we have in European forests. It's very important to mention that this is not area, this is number of assessments, because so it's not the area of the habitats, but it's the number of assessments that member states do. If you apply this criteria of area, you get to different results, but still showing that, of course, we are far from having a satisfactory biodiversity of European forest, but the figures will be different, of course, not be those ones. So this is important to underline. Now, going fast to some conclusive, let's say, some reflections, some food for thought also for your discussions. You talk about the impact of your policy on forest, or at least this was the topic for which I was supposed to set the scene. The impact of your forest, of your policy on forest, of course, it depends very, very much on the instrument that we have, and we do not have one single dedicated instrument on how forests should be managed or should not be managed. We have several pieces of legislation which affect forests either directly or indirectly, either in a general manner or in a specific manner. In some cases, referring to given areas, in some cases, referring to given practices. I'll just give you some examples here. For instance, under the Habitat Directive, if you have a forest which is part of a 2000 site, you need, before authorizing any activity which may impact on the ecological values of the site, you need to do a profit assessment that might lead to the decision not to intervene if that activity is incompatible with the purposes for the environmental protection of that site. That, of course, becomes more extreme in relation to strict protection, because strict protection, there are guidelines that, of course, indicate that although under a natural site you could still harvest, that's not incompatible, depending, of course, on the ecological values for which the site has been designated. But in principle, you could still harvest under strict protection. That is not possible, and that concerns the 3% of primary and overall forest. Then we have certain standards under the new Renewable Energy Directive, RED 3, where we have a geographic standard, in the sense that primary overall forests, but in this case, overall forests as defined by member states, are excluded from the possibility of sourcing for the purpose of considering the energy produced by this biomass as renewable and get the corresponding subsidies. So there is a kind of geographic standard. There is no outside that. There is no standard except rather general objective related to the way of harvesting with the view not to deplete the soil, in particular in relation to large clear cuts. Then I will not talk about the way this is implemented through particular to scientific issue. That could be a completely different chapter. We have more precise standards in the taxonomy than we have in RED 3, although they are partly similar, but in the taxonomy, which is a voluntary instrument, of course, is only for the green investments, and in the delegated act on climate adaptation mitigation, you have a number of very precise criteria for ensuring the say, avoiding to deplete the high biodiversity value sites. So that's really important. But of course, only applies voluntarily. It's not a requirement to apply everywhere. We have under the UDR, as you know, an obligation not to degrade forests. So we have these 4 types of forests: primary, naturally regenerated, plantation, planted forest and plantation, and you're not supposed to degrade forests. That means moving from one class to 2 classes lower than the one forests are, which is of course indirectly a standard for forest management as well. You have the LULUCF, which does not include any forest management standard, but of course, with the new LULUCF and the requirement to increase the removal from forests, you need to ensure that forests are more resilient and more vital, and also that we have more forests. We have guidelines. These are actually much more detailed in terms of prescribing, but of course these are guidelines. That this is not binding legislation. They do not prescribe the forest management practice. They only suggest the forest management practice on afforestation, on close residential forestry, and on the mapping and the definition and identification of old growth forests. Work in progress, the carbon removal certification framework, as you know, was adopted. It requires a mandatory co-benefits for biodiversity when it comes to carbon farming. So there is a methodology ongoing to be prepared to ensure that that would be the case. And then the nature restoration regulation, of course, also, although it does not impose any standard for forest management, but it requires an improvement of the status of 6 out of 7 indicators. Finally, a discussion by the co-legislator governance of forests, in order to have a more inclusive governance, particularly when it comes to expert groups with member states, to try to have people involved from different departments which reflect the multifunctionality of forests. This is now being discussed by Council and Parliament. The way it is developed in Council is, for us, not satisfactory. The Commission has made a declaration where it explains the reason why this general approach has not really much added value, and the Commission might even decide to withdraw that, but we have to see what the Parliament will say. That is actually all written in an official declaration of the Commission, and the Forest Monitoring Law, which has been also discussed by Council and Parliament, which would be the instrument that will allow us to improve the knowledge base that we need for knowing where we are and where we want to go, in particular for biodiversity, resilience, climate, and so on. And that leads me to my last slide. Here we go. So the key questions and issues for the future, of course, the main one is how to reconcile the demand for forest-based products with the protection and resilience, and the demand is increasing under bioeconomy debate. So that is actually the big question. The blanket is not sufficient. We need to ensure sourcing precautions if we want to increase the use of biomass for projects and so on. So what should we do? Standards for forest management, that's a question. Under the EU Forest Strategy, you have the announcement of standards for sustainable forest management but on a voluntary basis. And this is something which is left to the next Commission to work on that. I already mentioned the governance and the knowledge base. These are the 2 big topics which are discussed at the moment. So just to conclude, I still have 7 seconds. I think that we need to be aware of the complexity of the issue, but we need to be aware of the inevitability of further steps in protecting forests, because, as I said before, this is actually strictly related to resilience. I was yesterday in Bonn at the Ministerial Conference on Forest Europe, where there was a unanimous call for more intervention for multifunctionality, resilience, and cooperation. It would be nice to see that quest also at European level, not just at pan-European level, where of course it is a soft law with basically zero enforcement, although of course it has a lot of merits to promote this debate, but it would be nice to have this translated into instruments also at the European level. I'll stop here because I'm beyond the 20 minutes, so thank you very much. If there's any questions, I'm not available. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe some questions, one or two questions? Toby?
Maybe you can come here. Nice question for the microphone. Here.
Thank you. Hello, Marco. Good morning.
Hi,
Toby
Toby.
Akeroyd, Wild Europe Foundation. Thanks very much. That was a brilliant resume, as it were, of the forest of regulations, all aiming to improve conservation. The one thing that isn't there at the moment is the link to the financial incentives that foresters and the forestry sector needs to actually implement them. It's one reason why the nature restoration law nearly collapsed, and it's the main reason why there's so much opposition to a more comprehensive forest monitoring law if we're going to have any chance of putting any of these regulations into practice on a decent scale on the ground. Could you comment on that and what might be put in place to fill the gap?
Yes, thank you. I knew when I heard your voice, I knew you would put this question, Tommy. So because I didn't touch on the financial aspect, that's absolutely a key enabler. First of all, I would like to say that because it is often, there's a bit of a misconception. The treaty says clearly that it is for the member states to finance environmental protection. So environmental protection measures under the treaty are to be financed by the member states. This is in the treaty. Which says that unless it is, of course, disproportionate, then there could be community measures specific. Now, there was a big debate under the NRL and NRL, and you know that there is actually a request from the Commission to produce a report, including on the financial opportunities to finance restoration. That is actually a big chapter, a big question mark, the cost of restoration, although, as you know, it's also a bit of a biased debate because the cost of restoration are always put, and the same is happening with monitoring. People put in front of you the cost, but of course never do the benefits. And we know very well that €1 invested in restoration or €1 invested in monitoring is a much bigger profit that you get in terms of the results from having better and more healthy forests. So anyway, but just to tell you, yes, this is very much recognized by the Commission, and in fact, even the Commission President made it clear already in a couple of speeches that the big topic for the future will be the so-called biodiversity credit. So we have to try to do the same we did for carbon. For carbon today, companies could put money into certificates that are traded for climate removal or emission, greenhouse gas emission reductions. That doesn't exist for biodiversity except in a few schemes, which are, for instance, Australia has one, the UK has one. But the idea is to try to move to biodiversity credits in a way that this can also be traded, have a value of biodiversity that can be exchanged. We are organizing some tests, in particular on forest, with Estonian forests, and it will take time because it's extremely complicated, both from an economic and legal point of view, but I think that this is the inevitable way to give the right price to the resources. Because today, although it is true that the forest owners is depending on the revenue which is available on the market, it's also true that there is an externality which is not paid by anybody. So when we buy products, IKEA furniture or consume energy, we are causing an externality which is basically paid by the environment, and we need to take care of that. So I think that could be the big topic for the future.
Thank you. Zoltan, you have a question? Because we gotta keep the question short, we're already in overtime. Lina?
Hi, I'm Aaron, and I'm from the economic side. So we are trying to build a business, sustainable business for this solution. And the problem is there is no connection with the carbon credits. So it's like there is greenwashing in the carbon credit market that we know, and we are trying to build a separate credit market for forests. It doesn't make sense. So we should clean up the carbon credit market in the EU and connect the two incentives, because otherwise, and then it would be market finance. So the states don't have any money to finance this. We shouldn't be looking at the individual states. They are almost broke, most of them. So it has to be a market solution, and we are working on this. So if you would like to have some kind of feedback, we are open to discussion. The technology is available and cheap for monitoring, for remote sensing. We also have the solutions, even for deciduous forests, so not only for pine, so multi-layer forests. So everything exists, but nothing is connected. So the question was spot on. Thank you.
Okay, can I just say, we could talk about biodiversity credits the entire day. So, let's leave it like, Zoltan?
My last question, we heard yesterday that the EUDR is going to be postponed based on the proposal of the Commission. Can you comment on that, Marco?
Okay, well, very briefly, I mean, on UDR, I know as much as you do. I learned it yesterday from the press release, so you know how this has caused worries in terms of implementation. So this is very new. There's nothing I can tell you that you probably don't know already. So we'll have to see how the proposal is done. What else? The co-legislature. Just a very brief. I mean, the intervention before was more a comment than a question. But I do agree with you. Of course, it has to be the biodiversity have to be credible if this is developed. I would just dispute that the states do not have money, because it's a question of choice, because the states have a lot of money when it comes to state aid to certain industrial sectors or to financing certain policies. But of course, the environment is always the lowest priority in that case. So I wouldn't say that the states are broken so they cannot protect the environment. They could if they wanted. But of course, I agree with you. We need to bring in the private finance, and we have to do it in a credible way.
Okay, thank you. Just one last comment, Marco, because you said biodiversity. I think it's important to understand that biodiversity actually includes wildlife. Because many times, when you talk about forests, it's just about the diversity of plants. But in reality, the science shows it's actually animals that are the managers of an ecosystem, and they control the carbon cycle in the end. So, because like Sweden right now is reducing resilience in two ways, it's logging its forests and it's culling its animals. So, okay, just a remark, the biodiversity must include actually the trophic chain and wildlife. Thank you very much, Marco. I think we could talk the entire day with you. Yeah? I mean, it was very interesting. Maybe we can we have your slides, because they're actually very compact slides. Very good,
This is what I wanted to ask, Marco. Please send me your slides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the time, Marco. It was great talking with you. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on now to the session number 1, which is about the old growth forest. We got 3 speakers, and this is Martin Mikolas, this is Renzo Motta, and that is Zoltan. If you could just please take a seat here, and we start out with Martin Mikolas from the Czech University of Life Sciences. Will inform us about the remote primary forest project. So the aim really is to get a good understanding of what the kind of old growth forest is that still exists in Europe and requires serious protection. Martin?
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present in front of such a nice audience. Remote forest or remote primary forest project is a long-term collaborative efforts of many scientists across 10 countries. And I will try to show you today some highlights of our research, which are important for strengthening the conservation efforts. So for us, as foresters or forest ecologists, the primary forests are very important reference sites to assess the impacts of climate change. We all know that the climate change has a very strong impact of what's happening right now in the forests. Besides the increasing temperatures and climate extremes, the natural disturbances are increasing, and the predictions are quite worrisome. Large-scale beetle outbreaks, windthrows, fires are ongoing globally, and of course Europe is not an exception. And as we observed large-scale outbreaks in our regions, we were motivated actually to study more and better understand the primary forests as reference. So one of the main questions which motivated us to start with this research was if the present-day outbreaks that we observe across the primary forests are only result of climate change, or if we can find some historical evidence about such events in the past. So the Remote Primary Forest Project is focused on mountain temperate forests. So we mostly work in 10 European countries. We established approximately 1,200 study plots and collected more than 30,000 tree courses. Dendrochronology is an important part of this project. We are interested, as I mentioned, especially in the disturbance history, in the drivers of the disturbance dynamics, and how this impacts the biodiversity and carbon accumulation in spruce-dominated and mixed beech-dominated temperate primary forests. I guess all of you know the first primary forest map published by Francesco Maria Sabatini. Already at this map, you can see that most of these temperate primary forests are situated in the southeastern and eastern Europe. So that's where our main focus of this research is. Important part of our work is the identification of primary forests. So we spent lots of time searching for these localities, and we were actually surprised how many primary forests were still not mapped and identified. Just to show you some examples, it was also possible to find entire primary forest valleys. You can see here these beautiful drone pictures from typical Carpathian mixed fir, beech, spruce forests. As an example, I need to mention the Boja Valley, which is 10 kilometers long valley without the trail, without the road, where for decades actually most likely nobody went, even the forest owners have never been there. So it's kind of luck to find such treasures, and it's still possible. So the problem is that still many of these primary and old-growth forests are not mapped and not identified, and that is very difficult to protect them, of course. Impossible to protect them. Here are a few pictures how it looks like. So when we identified such localities, we need to come into the field, bring lots of equipment, and often we need to climb rivers, cross rivers, climb cliffs, and bring all this equipment up to these remote localities. And we stay in the forest, so we sleep weeks and weeks in the forest every season. And collect, of course, all the stem structural data. We do classical inventories of forest structures, which means tree positions, tree heights, deadwood, regeneration, tree-related microhabitats, canopy openness, and of course we collect data on the dendrochronological data using the increment borders. Using this tree course, we are able then to analyze age of the forest and the disturbance history. As I mentioned, we were able to create possibly one of the largest dendrochronological databases from temperate primary forests, which contains more than 30,000 tree cores. So it's a lot of work. It's a big teamwork. Many people are involved in this, and we use the dendrochronological tree data especially to analyze the disturbance history. We are able to reconstruct how many times the forests were disturbed by windrows, beetle outbreaks during the past centuries. So back to the question, we were interested if these recent outbreaks that we observe, if they are only a result of climate change, or if we can see and detect signal on such events in the very past. So when we compiled the dataset from the spruce primary forests in the Carpathian Mountains, which covers countries such as Romania, Ukraine, Slovakia, and Czech Republic, we can see that there was a peak in the disturbance activity during the 19th century and very early beginning of the 20th century. And then during the 20th century, you can see there is a low activity of natural disturbances. So nowadays we are again in a period where the forests are more susceptible. So we can say that the reduced disturbance rate since 1920s, which is a potential legacy of this higher severity disturbance, which is synchronized, regionally synchronized across these different regions, is one of the main drivers of these recent wide outbreaks that we can observe. So not only climate change is the driver, we have to say that these forests experienced such events in the past and they are well adapted to such events. I need to highlight the Făgăraș Mountains in Romania, which is probably the largest primary forest landscape in temperate Europe, still largely unprotected. What makes it so unique that you can observe different forest vegetation types in across valley systems. So you have a landscape, primary forest landscape that covers different forest vegetation types, which is very unique in Europe, because usually only fragments of primary and outdoor forests remained. And this allowed us to compare the disturbance regimes of beech-dominated and spruce-dominated forests, which was, the results were quite surprising, because you can see that the disturbances that appeared in the beech-dominated forests were almost comparable in terms of severity to the spruce-dominated forests, and they were also synchronized. So here are some examples of the natural disturbances. This is typical beetle outbreak. These are windstorms in mixed beech-dominated forests, some patchy disturbance in beech-dominated forests, but also larger disturbances. Is very interesting example from the Izvoarele Nerei primary forest in Romania in the Semenic Mountains. The scale of this disturbance in the largest European Union primary forest is approximately 300 hectares. So yeah, you can imagine like this really big 50 meters tall trees falling down like matches. But we have historical evidence of such events. So this is the way how these forests actually work. Also through larger disturbances. Again, I need to mention that primary forests are not only the old forests, as is often wrongly interpreted in many national scale definitions. Primary forests are mosaic and they contain also young developmental phases, like you can see in this picture, which resulted after natural disturbances. Primary forests are important habitats for many rare and endangered species, not only large carnivores like lynx, wolves, and bears, but also many other less visible creatures. And as we see in our data how much the disturbance history is shaping the present-day structures of the forest, we were also interested if this historical development has some impact on the contemporary biodiversity. So we collected data on multiple taxonomic groups, especially on lichens, fungi, beetles, and birds in the Western Carpathians across several primary forest stands. The data set was very nice because we found also species that were originally extinct. We found many critically endangered species, and of course many vulnerable species, which highlights the important role of protecting these amazing ecosystems. And after compiling this data set, we related the contemporary biodiversity patterns to the historical disturbance events. And actually, not surprisingly, we can see that these disturbances over centuries influence the current biodiversity patterns. So what we see now in the forest in terms of species composition is not only a result of some recent activities, but it's really a result of this long-term, centuries long-term impacts of the dynamics of these disturbances. The response was non-linear and varied in across the different disturbance matrices. So in these three-dimensional graphs, you can see that the total species richness is highest in the forests that were disturbed with higher severity disturbances longer time ago. But on the other hand, the red listed species richness increases in disturbances that were disturbed by lower severity disturbances approximately 150 years ago, as well as is increasing with higher severity disturbances that occurred recently. On the other hand, the functional diversity, which can be used as an indicator of ecological resilience, was highest in the 70% disturbed forest. So again, the higher severity disturbances of approximately 70% canopy area disturbed increased the functional richness in time, also with time since disturbance. One more highlight of this direct analysis of this disturbance history to the biodiversity, the total species richness increased with the disturbance frequency. So the higher was the number of disturbances during these 300 years, the higher was the proportional richness. How does it work? So, of course, the disturbance history, such as time since disturbance, disturbance severity, and number of disturbance events, and their combination impact the forest structures, which creates diverse mosaic of habitats for different groups. So different groups of species responded to different disturbance variables as well to different structures. What is important to mention that the most critical structures that impact the species compositions in the primary forest are the canopy openness, so the light in the forest, volume of deadwood, diversity and variability of deadwood, the maximum tree age, the burial trees, and also the diversity of tree-related microhabitats. All of these variables are very difficult to find in managed forests and are very typical for natural and primary forests. So the current biodiversity that we observe in the primary forest is outcome of long-term complex disturbance processes. So the disturbances are actually maintaining the biodiversity and the biodiversity-rich forests. On the other hand, interfering with these natural processes can lead to a decline in biodiversity patterns over time. But what is the practice? What is the reality? Generally, despite all this knowledge that is rapidly increasing in the science or in the scientific world, there is still very low acceptance of natural disturbances as a management tool in protected areas. And salvage logging is the dominant driver of primary and old forest loss, and it's a legal driver. To conduct salvage logging in remote areas, first you need to build roads, huge roads, like in this picture, often through primary and old-growth forests, which cause a lot of erosion and have many other negative effects on the ecosystem, including the expansion of invasive species and so on. As I mentioned, many of the primary forests, also the forests where we work on, the top quality primary forests that we were able to identify, are still not mapped, are still not protected. We lost already several of our study plots, for example, in Romania, namely in the Făgăraș Mountains, where also recently there are some sites that were just impacted very closely by logging activities. For a long time, we are communicating this problem with the authorities, but somehow it's just impossible to get these sites under protection. Here is one of the sites where just last year was occurring logging just next to our plot. So just to give you some examples, but of course Romania is not the only country. We could stay here a longer time to showcase the case from every country. But here, for example, Czech Republic, the oldest strict reserve in Czech Republic with a very famous Bobin primary forest. You can see that even within the strict reserve, large-scale silage logging occurred. You see that. Slovakia, Western Carpathians, inside of the core zone of national parks, approximately 80 kilometers square of capercaillie habitats, which are mostly old growth and natural forests, were salvage logged during a very, very short period. I have to stop this because I'm just recently working on a new conservation action plan for the capercaillie, which is a species for which this area was designed actually. And we can see that how these wrong management decisions and the loss of these natural habitats and old growth forests resulted not only in the fragmentation of its habitats, but already in the fragmentation that is visible on the genetic level. So we can observe in this figure, you can see that every color is different genetic subpopulation. So the population was broken into 3 different subpopulations that don't communicate, and none of them is sufficiently large to be viable in long term. And it's a big question if it's still possible to restore this population while still the issue of losing their habitat is not solved. Approximately 20,000 of hectares of its suitable habitats are still not protected and are unlikely to be protected. I'm mentioning this case because these wrong management decisions and this low acceptance of natural disturbance in this particular case resulted in lost court of Slovak Republic with the European Commission. So the situation is very, very serious. Yeah, just coming back to the definitions of the primary forests. Often, of course, it's very important for us to understand where we have the best forests which have lowest impact by humans. But on the other hand, when we focus the conservation efforts only on protection of this, at the end, often small little patches of this really like top primary and old growth forests, then such conservation efforts will result in a very fragmented, protected area network. As you can see here, this primary forest became isolated within a clear-cut landscape, which for the biodiversity conservation doesn't make much sense because the species thriving in this primary forest will be very isolated and might experience extinction depth, as we can observe it on the capercaillie example. On the other hand, we have also good examples how the primary forest reserve should be designed. This is Ticha and Koprova Valley, where the primary forests contain some of the oldest pines that can exceed 1,000 years, some of the oldest pines of Carpathians. But again, they are relatively small patches. But in this case, the entire valley system was protected. And here we can observe that the primary forests really serve as source populations, and the previously managed forests, here with the blue color, it's a natural disturbance, it's a windthrow and bark beetle outbreak combination that introduced heterogeneity in the previously managed and homogeneous forests. It increased the amounts of deadwood, light, and the structure is very complex, and we can observe how some of the primary forest species already now migrate and colonize these previously homogeneous managed forests. This is also true for the tree species such as Pinus tembra. It's coming down to the lower elevations. So we can see also transfer from this pure spruce monoculture to more mixed and resilient forests through natural processes, through rewilding. We also analyzed the impact of natural disturbances on the trade-offs between forest biodiversity and carbon. And of course, the disturbances introduce quite significant trade-offs in these two functions, but at the larger scale, the trend is opposite. We observed high co-benefits in terms of carbon and biodiversity across larger landscapes. So protecting the large areas of forest landscapes will maintain not only the biodiversity, but also the long-term carbon storage, especially in the times with increasing disturbance severities and frequencies. So just to conclude this, natural disturbances such as windthrows and beetle outbreaks are natural parts of forest dynamics, and they maintain the critical habitat structures for forest communities. Conservation of primary forests and old-growth forests is still slow. Many forests are not mapped, not protected, and of course the conservation of only primary forests is not sufficient to achieve biodiversity conservation goals. So we really need to focus on larger landscapes, on valley systems, on processes. We as scientists, we believe that the only way, because we are still living in times when we are losing the old growth forests, while we know we need to restore them. So the situation is very bad. So we believe implementing logging moratorium on areas that potentially harbor old growth forest would be a solution, while all the process of mapping and conservation can follow. So thank you very much for attention.